issue of racism in the U.S. is once again under the spotlight as football player Colin Kaepernick refuses to stand for the national anthem before an NFL game in protest at oppression against the people of color.
The message is that we have a lot of issues in this country that we need to deal with. We have a lot of people that are oppressed. We have a lot of people that aren't treated equally, aren't given equal opportunities. Police brutality is a huge thing that needs to be addressed.
Kaepernick pledged to continue with his silent protest into the regular season. He was backed by his team and some basketball players of the NBA.
The actions taken by the San Francisco 49er athlete were very courageous, very righteous, and he had every right to protest standing for the national anthem, and that was an act of resistance, which is happening all over the country as we see African people rising up in Milwaukee and in many other places demanding an end to the police violence that happens every single day against African people in this country, because what we see in this country is deeper than racism or institutional racism. It is colonialism.
However, the professional football player faced a barrage of criticism, including from Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump, who told him to, quote, find a country that works better for him, unquote. This is not the first time an athlete has staged such a protest. Back in 1995, NBA player Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf similarly refused to stand for the anthem, sparking the same sorts of reactions. In 2004, baseball player Carlos Delgado made a similar move to express his opposition to the U.S. wars on Iraq and Afghanistan. Jackie Robinson, who was the first African American to have played in the U.S. Major Baseball League, also had problems saluting the U.S. national anthem. The U.S. has for centuries been plagued by widespread racism and ethnic discrimination. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first African-American president, raising many minority groups' hopes that racial discrimination was eradicated. However, 7 years later, this is what Obama had to say about racism in the U.S.
Racism, we are not cured of. Societies don't overnight completely erase everything that happened 200 to 300 years prior.
Even various opinion polls show the deterioration of the situation for U.S. minority groups. In a 2015 nationwide poll conducted by CNN and the Kaiser Family Foundation, roughly half of Americans described racism as a big problem in the U.S. Last year, another study found that young black men were 9 times more likely to be killed by police officers compared with other Americans, while non-white Americans made up only 37% of the U.S. population. More than 47% of all people killed by police belong to a minority.
The United States of America was born from the enslavement of African people and genocide against the indigenous people of this land and the theft of their land and colonialism all over the world. That is how America was born. That is how parasitic capitalism was born, as explained by the theory of African internationalism developed by Chairman Omali Yeshitela of the African People's Socialist Party. And therefore, the American flag represents genocide and war and imperialism to the vast majority of the peoples on the planet.
The U.S. has witnessed a surge in fatal police shootings of African Americans, which triggered nationwide protests. Calls for change in the U.S. justice system and police force have been gaining momentum. But still, African Americans seem to be facing a tough road ahead in trying to resolve the problem. Observers believe that it's hard to change the violent police culture that has been institutionalized in the force over decades.
There are no signs Turkey will end its intervention in Syria anytime soon. Ankara has sent more tanks into the Syrian territory to open a new front in the region, where it has already deployed a substantial force. On Saturday, Turkish channels and international news agencies aired images of the Turkish army trucks carrying the tanks to the border from where they rolled into the Syrian territory from Turkey's Kilich province. Shortly afterwards, reports said the Turkish troops had entered the Syrian town of Al-Rai, near the border, to allegedly support an operation by the militant group known as the Free Syrian Army against Daesh. The FSA captured the Syrian town of Jarablus with the help of the Turkish forces days ago.
Contrary to what the Turkish government says, and contrary to what Western media is saying, the Turkish incursion in northern Syria is not actually aimed against ISIS. It's actually aimed against the Kurds, the YPG. And if we're talking about a Turkish alliance in northern Syria, well, that alliance is comprised of the so-called Free Syrian Army, which is an Islamist terrorist organization and which has been responsible for carrying out heinous atrocities up and down Syria since 2011 against Muslims and Christians alike.
Damascus has already condemned Ankara's incursion into the Syrian territory as a flagrant aggression and a violation of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia and Iran, which are allies of Syria, have criticized the intervention, while the US, an adversary that is said to be bent on bringing about regime change in Syria, also has its reservations regarding the issue. US Defense Secretary Ash Carter last week noted that Washington had called on Turkey to stay focused on the fight against Daesh and not engage the Kurdish and Arab Forces alliance known as the SDF. The US provided air support for Turkey in the first 2 days of the operation, but it was withdrawn once Turkey began to capture ground and villages south of Jarablus. In yet another controversy displaying US's scramble strategy, the subsequent clashes between Turkish-supported rebels and the SDF constituted a fight of fighting between two US-supported groups, basically a display of two US proxies firing US-supplied ammunition at one another. The Turkish military deployments in Syria have raised many questions as to the real motives behind Turkey's intervention in its southern neighbor. What is clear is that Turkey is after carving out a buffer zone in northern Syria, and Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan somehow admitted this. After intervening in Syria, Turkey must decide whether to declare operation a success or to push ahead with its offensive, which is widely believed to be directed against the Kurdish fighters in the face of US opposition. Thus, the main goal of the Turkish operation is to push back Kurdish fighters from the border regions. This automatically verifies the theory that fighting Daesh is merely a front for the real objectives Turkey pursues in Syria.
India and the United States this past week signed a strategic deal that allows their respective militaries to use each other's land, air, and naval bases for resupply and repair operations. The U.S. has similar logistics agreements with other countries, but for Washington and New Delhi, this deal is specifically important. The two countries do not share a mutual defense treaty, but they have grown closer in recent years through joint military training and arms deals. And their so-called Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement deepens and formalizes those ties.
In our discussions today, we looked at how this could provide further energy and momentum to our partnership on defense technology and manufacturing. We agreed to continue efforts to establish a fast and efficient framework to encourage tie-ups between our defense companies.
It is so critical that we respond to what we both know. We both know the pain of terrorism. And to avoid repeating the tragedies that we've seen, our intelligence agencies now exchange information constantly. Our security personnel are learning from one another. We recently signed a special agreement to share terrorist screening data, and we are united in our efforts to dispel extremist propaganda and ties and lies.
The United States appears to have devised this surprise military alliance with India in response to an emerging threat, namely China. In fact, observers believe that both Washington and New Delhi have already become wary of China's rapid military modernization, and a specific area of concern may be tensions in the South China Sea. Many now believe that Beijing will see the alliance between the U.S. and India as a provocation.
We want to support a code of conduct for the management of the South China Sea. We support diplomacy in an effort to try to resolve this with an understanding that there really is no, quote, military solution. But on the other hand, we will stand up for our rights, and we will stand with our allies, particularly where we have a defense agreement, in protecting that agreement and in protecting the rights of other nations with respect to their freedom of navigation and the legitimacy of a process under rule of law for the resolution of legitimate claims.
This agreement is part of maintaining a rather equidistant position between Washington and Beijing, and I think the Chinese understand that as well, that their priorities geographically are toward the South China Sea, toward point east and north, not directly in conflict with the Indians, which are focused more on the Indian Ocean. That they do obviously have their points of tension over their territorial dispute in the Kashmir region, but that I think is something that's more or less compartmentalized from New Delhi's strategy.
Some are looking with serious doubts whether U.S. efforts to woo India in its own sphere will eventually work. This specifically when considering the history of mistrust between the two.
They have issues with China. They also have some common interests with China. They have a good relationship with the United States, but there are complications there as well. Our long-standing partnership with Pakistan. India has generally had very good ties with Iran. The United States generally does not have good ties with Iran. India, I think, is pursuing a balanced regional policy that puts India first, which is what you would expect them to do.
Both India and the United States have been supporting each other's adversaries throughout the past decades. New Delhi had been in the camp of the Soviet Union for years, while Washington was supporting Islamabad. But could the deal that they signed this past week be a turning point in their relations? If this would be the case, the dynamics of politics in Southern Asia may see a major change. The effects have already happened. Obama's Asia pivot has pushed China towards Pakistan while aggravating India. A series of joint Chinese-Pakistani infrastructure projects, called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, is one example of the growing ties between China and Washington.